So welcome everyone and welcome to the IATI Validator webinar that we are running today. So I'm presenting, so I'm Petra Kangalova and I'm joined by my colleague Amy Silcock from the IATI Technical Team, and we'll be presenting today. We aim to take probably an hour maximum for the webinar, and as I said, we'll do a brief presentation and then there'll be an opportunity very much for you to ask questions, to check and use the tool. And I've shared that as well in the chat box. So moving on to the agenda for today and what we plan on covering. So what I want to really start with is what is the IATI Validator, to look a bit more at the bigger picture and contextualize it into IATI's strategic plan that I'm sure some of you would have seen, and what the importance really is of the tool in improving data quality, which is one of our strategic objectives. Then focusing very much on what the validator checks. So there are different types of validation messages, which is important for you as users to understand what they are, and I'll focus quite a bit on that. And then what we'll move into is actually demoing, so showing the tool and how the functionality of how you can use it. So checking your data and the public data viewer, and that's what Amy will be showing today. And we plan on having quite a lot of time for you to be using the tool and very much sharing your feedback or questions. So we do really want this webinar to be interactive. We want to hear from you, answer any questions that you have. And then very briefly, I'll talk about next steps. So that's the plan for today. And thanks again to everyone for joining us. So importance of the validator, before jumping into very much the tool and how it works, what I wanted to start with is very much recognizing the importance of it. So as you know, in IATI, we have a strategic plan from 2020 to 2025 with 3 key objectives. And as you see, they're very interlinked. One of them is very much driving a significant improvement in the quality of data, systematic use of IATI data, and also strengthening the standard. But in order for us to get there, to really have this systematic and significant changes and improvements of data quality by 2025, what we are starting with this year is the use of the validator and very much encouraging publishers to use the tool to be able to make fixes to their data. And we as a secretariat would also very proactively engage with publishers, with our members, to address this subset of data quality issues. And it's important to recognize that that's a step, and it's looking at specific rule set and schema that I'll talk about. But it's a very, I think, exciting and significant step in being able to reach the goal of having better quality data. And alongside that, what I briefly wanted to mention, again, just to contextualize the importance of the validator, is in additional, we'll also be looking at organizations, and especially those of you joining as publishers, and understanding better how you can make those fixes to the data, how you prepare it, and having a better understanding on the preparation and improvements to the data, as well as on the data use side, as I mentioned, the kind of clear linkages on the partner country analysis and needs, and what are those key issues. So here, very much wanted to contextualize that the validator is a step in that process, and it's quite an exciting one for organizations and for publishers to be looking at improvements to the data, so we can really go towards significant drive in data quality and data use. And now moving on to what you probably want to hear in more detail today is what is actually the validator. So I hope you have seen or clicked already on the tool. And as you know, the tool has been in development for since last year. We had a testing phase and there were improvements done to it, and we were very happy that we have now officially launched the tool in September. And it's basically what the validator is. is an online tool free for anyone to use, and for checking if your data aligns with the rules of IATI and some of the guidance. And I'll go in more detail about those specific checks that you'll be interested to hear more. But very much it's a tool that would allow publishers to look at their data and be able to make that step in improving the quality of IATI data for those subset of rules that we'll be talking about. And I think one important thing as well to note is, the validator is also integrated with the data store, and that's quite an important thing for you to understand on the use side, or what implications, if there are any errors in your data, would have for users, for those who want to access and use the data. So moving on to a bit more about what the validator is. So there are some common questions that we get asked, and I would advise you to look at the validator question and answer if there are things that you want to find out more about the validator. But some of the key things to understand, again, is who can use the validator. As I mentioned already, it's a public tool for anyone to use. We're very much, as a secretariat, be proactively engaging with publishers and organizations to be using the tool in order to make those changes and improvements to the data. But of course, the tool is available for anyone. If they're users of the data who want to check specific data sets, they're also able to do that. Another common question on the validator is how likely it is that an IATI publisher would have invalidator or would have errors. And this is indeed, the first time that we have a tool that allows for those checks according to the IATI standard rules that you'll be able to verify. So it is very likely that there are errors in the data, but it's a great opportunity to be able to easily identify, and we'll go in more detail on that, and make improvements. So don't worry on this one. I think it's more looking at the step change and the improvements in the data. And the last thing here I wanted to mention is maybe for some of you who joined the webinar, have used an old public validator that was available. And that was a very simple tool that was just checking only the schema, so only simple aspects of the IATI standard. So that's a tool that obviously with the new validator would no longer be supported. So I think for existing users, that's something that's quite important to know and understand. But yeah, I think that's mainly on the questions, and yeah, do have a look at the Q&A if there are any further questions that you have. So moving on, so I think the key bit in understanding what the validator checks, which probably you're most interested in. So there are 3 types of validation messages that you can receive looking at a specific file. So I'll be presenting this, and then when Amy does the demo, I think we'll really bring this to light for you. So there are 3 types of validation messages, and what it's important here to understand is the kind of level of the importance and also the implications for data use. So the 3 types of validation messages that you can receive are critical, errors, and warning, and they're obviously separated in different colors for kind of ease of use. I'll go in more detail about each one, but maybe in this kind of overall and overview slide, it's important to understand that when there are critical, if you get a critical message, that means that there's something significantly not compliant with IATI and what we call the kind of format in the schema. But what that means is that your data file will not be available in the data store. So if those critical issues exist, that means that's a barrier for users to be able to check the data. And then with errors and warnings, those are improvements that can happen. So focusing on the critical one that I've just mentioned. So what do we mean by critical? Like what types of issues are considered critical? So for instance, if IATI data is not published in an XML format, obviously that would be received as a critical message. In IATI, there's a small subset of mandatory elements and there's a specific order in which the elements are present. So if any of that is wrong, that's again a critical message. And we've also data following version 2 of the standard. So version 1 of the standard is no longer supported. So for instance, if you have a data file that's still in version 1, you would get that critical message, and it's important that because of that, users will not be able to access the data through the data store. And this is just an example of some of the critical messages that you would get. And I think with the examples that Amy will show, you would see that, but obviously with some of them, they can be more technical. So depending on the tool or the publishing tool you're using or the in-house systems that you have, there are changes that you might need to speak to your technical team or IT to be able to fix those. So that's on critical. So moving on to error. So error and warning, again, those are messages that you would receive in the validator, but currently they'll have no implications for the data file being accessible in the data store. So what is an error? The error messages that you would get or you would see in the files, they follow IATI's mandatory rules, and kind of in more technical language, we say the kind of wording where it uses the word must. What's important with this is that they are, they're mandatory rules, and they were made mandatory because they were implemented through IATI standard upgrade processes, through consultation with community, and there are important rules to be followed so that the data is usable. So for instance, having specific code lists, so the language must be a valid code. At what level, for instance, you report a sector, whether that's an activity or a transaction level. Another example is if you have multiple sectors, for instance, allocated for an activity, that your sector percentage adds up to 100%. And that, of course, would have implications if people want to use the data in terms of being able to analyze, and if there are errors there, that would cause complications for them too. And then the third message in the validator is the warning. So those are additional, those is what we call IATI's recommendations. So those in kind of the technical documentation are containing the word should. So those are recommendations that were again agreed by the community, and some of those examples are for specific code lists. For instance, if a publisher uses a non-DAC classifications or system, is something that currently is a recommendation for organizations to use. So when checking a data set, you would receive that. And there are some warnings as well on the use of an identifier. So for the specific structure, and you would receive that as well as a warning message. Moving on, I think, to the next slide. So hopefully what I've talked through now, and then I'll hand over briefly to Amy, is just to give you a bit of an overview of the types of validation messages and the importance that they have in for users. So we've talked about critical, error, and warnings. And hopefully now with the demo that Amy will present, we'll bring this more to life in terms of how that looks when checking data and the two options that you have. So I'll hand over to you, Amy, to show.
Thanks, Betcha. I hope you guys can all hear me. So we're about to look at the validator itself. So as the live tool, if you have any questions as we go along, please can you put them in the chat, and I'll try and respond to them as we go through and look at the validator. So please do engage that way. So let's, this is like the page of the IATI Validator. And the first thing that we want to show you is the public data viewer. So what we can see here is the 1,215 organizations that are currently publishing data to IATI. And this should be updating roughly daily. It's not quite real time, but hopefully it's close enough. And then what we get to do is you choose your organization or the organization that you're interested in. And then we can begin to filter through the list of organizations. And then we get to choose one. Say this time we want to look at African initiatives. And what we'll see on the screen is a validation report for each file that that organization is publishing. So we know in IATI that you have both activity and organization files, and they have slightly different rules and they've got different content. And we currently check each of these files individually. So let's have a look at their activities file. And here is an example of a file that has all three types of validation issues. It has a critical error, it has 12 errors, as well as 1 warning. And we've got the details on the right-hand side, going into more detail, and you've got links to the guidance pages for the different error types where there are guidance pages available. On the left-hand side, we can click into each of the critical errors and the warnings. And what this allows us to do is we get to begin to filter what we want to see. So it might be that you're going, okay, maybe as an organization, I've sorted my critical error. I've also sorted some of my errors. And then I begin to see a tailored version of the errors, the warnings on the right-hand side. And what we get to see at the top here is we know it's the activity file, and then we get feedback per activity. So for this one, an activity title we can see is missing. We have a link to the specific activity, and this will take us to dportal, which will hopefully allow you to begin to see the errors in that visualization, or through that we can also access the XML for that activity to see what's going wrong. So the first error we've got coming up here is with identification. And we begin to read this through, and it says organization type must be present in reporting org African initiatives. So if we know our IATI standard, if we're used to entering the data, we'll probably recognize that reporting org is one of the elements that you need in every single activity. And so this tells us that the organization type is missing. And that's what we'll need to add in order to correct this error. We've also got a similar one below, but this time it's the organization identifier must be present. So we can presume quite happily that the organization identifier is missing. And so what this African initiatives will need to do is work through the different errors and begin to go correct them in their data. Hopefully that currently all makes sense. And down on the bottom left-hand side, there's a slightly different way. So we can begin to view the different kind of errors by category. So it might be that as an organization, you've decided, okay, I'm going to work on my identification errors. And this way we can also kind of unfilter the others. And then you can just see which are the activities with the identification errors left. So that might be a helpful way, depending on how you would like to work on fixing the quality of your data. Now, if you have worked on the quality of your data, maybe you don't want to publish it just yet because you want to check it again in the validator before you republish. And so a way of doing that is to go to the check data option. And this is where, instead of the validator picking up already published files, you can add in your own IATI XML file. There are two ways of doing this. We can either add in the web address, so if you have the URL for where your file is hosted, you can add this in. Or we can upload a file from our computer. So let's just have a go at doing this. So we open up our documents and say I've downloaded 4 of UNDP's IATI XML file. I can highlight them all, and upload them together. So this is a new functionality that our old validator didn't have, in that we can upload multiple XML files at the same time. We'll then click the upload button. The larger the file, the longer it will take to upload, so please do bear that in mind. And then we begin to validate. Now, the validation process isn't the quickest process in the world, so it may take a little bit of time before the validation results will appear for you. But whilst you're waiting for this, there are some things to note. We can either add some more files, because maybe you are doing a bulk load that you want to check. There is also the option to add in your email address. And what this will do is means you don't have to keep this page open, but you will get an email from the validator about when the validation results are ready. The validation will probably take quite a long time because I'm also on the Zoom call. So we can check back later to see how that's doing. And please note that the validation reports this way will be available for 72 hours, which means you'll also get it to share it with your colleagues or your stakeholders if that is needed. So one of the things that we want to do in the demo is do a bit more of a live example. So would someone like to volunteer their organization? And what we're going to do is we're going to go and check what their validation reports say. So please do post in the chat if you're happy for us to go and have a look at your data in the validator. And if not, I will choose someone. Or Annalise has nominated the African Development Bank. So here we go. So we've got the African Development Bank. So we've typed it in. And what we can see is they have a large number of files. At the moment, there is the slight hiccup that if you're publishing files by country, you will have to go and check each of them individually. But what you'll find is probably there are similar errors in each of them. So doing a sample check across a few is a good way forwards. So here we've clicked into one of their activities. And what we can see is there are 2 errors. So well done, African Development Bank. That is a really good result. And so what we can see is that out of the 2 issues, the first one is that the organization type is invalid. And the second is the description has no narrative content. So once again, on the right-hand side, we can see the different activities. We've got their title, we've got their link to dportal, and it tells us that the organization type is invalid for some value. We don't quite know what this is, but there is a way that we can go and find out. So on the right-hand side, we've got a guidance link. So if you would like to see guidance about how to correct the error, if you click on that link, we'll be taken to the code list, and this will let us know of all the different types of codes for the different organization types that we need to be using. The other option is if we click into dportal, it will take you directly to the that particular activity. So we can see all the details here. And if you want to then dive into the XML, we can click onto the XML link. And then we can do a search to see if we can go find the error, if I can spell type correctly. And what we can see here, or what I've spotted straight away, is that under the participating org, we've got the role 1, we've got a reference, but we can also see that the type is blank. So that's one way that you can begin to pick up where exactly these errors are occurring and dig a bit deeper to find out how you can go and fix them. If we jump back to our validation results, we can see that the UNDP files are beginning to validate. This should be quicker on your laptop because you hopefully aren't also presenting on Zoom at the same time and sharing your screen. So we click into the UNDP file. And what we get to see here is that, congratulations, this particular UNDP file has no critical issues and it's also got no errors in it. This doesn't mean You may also still have warnings, and the warnings are kind of the shoulds. This is where there is a bit of guidance within the IATI standard, but it's not always applicable to everything, and the validator can't make that judgment call. So these are just kind of, the warnings are almost like notifications as a, go check this. It may be okay, but also it may not be okay. So areas for you as the publisher to look into. That concludes the live demo of our validator. If you do have questions, please do put them in the chat. And we will now move into a time for feedback and questions, and hopefully also for you guys to have a go at using the validator. Petra, I will hand back over to you.
Thanks a lot, Amy, and hopefully that's that gave everyone a bit of a view of how the validator works, and maybe you got excited about starting to use the validator. So we have half an hour left, and that's kind of how we planned it, and we have a lot of actually a lot more time for your feedback and discussion. So as Amy just showed you, you can use the public data viewers, or you can also check data. But what we want to do now is, if all of you, we've provided the link, go into the validator, you can select either your organization or pick another organization, up to you. And we framed some questions, which I think what will be really, really useful is, obviously we have launched the tool, and it's up to you as the publishers and as the users to kind of to share your feedback on whether you understand the different types of validation messages that I've just talked through, and Amy as well presented. Are there any improvements that can happen there to make them clearer? Whether you understand the implications for data use. So we mentioned already the difference between, critical error warnings, whether you can easily identify the issues in the validation report in your data. So some of the things that Amy just talked about, when you identify an error, how you then link and go to dportal and identify it, and then whether you can easily follow the guidance. So the links we have provided. So those are the framing questions where we would really like to open it for discussion, and either hear from you now, if you're currently clicking on the validator and has any feedback to share. Because the validator is out there, is a tool to be used, and we as a Secretariat and Tech team would love to hear your feedback and how you're currently using the tool. How often does the validation report update? So the way that the validation reports work is, if a data has been refreshed, so obviously the data is picked up from the data store. So if there are any updates, it checks the next 48 hours. But it runs through. What is useful to maybe show is, if, for instance, a validation report has not, you're not seeing the link there, it would give you a reference to, let's say, a queue of when the last report has been refreshed. But if you update your data, it would take probably up to 48 hours for that refresh to show. And I think what Amy showed today, and what is quite useful to hear from publishers, is obviously, as you make fixes to a data, whether you automatically check, can you use to do everything in and out, or should we use the UI? That's a very good question, and that's what we really, thanks, Leo. On Loris, thank you for your question on the API. So that's one where we really want to consult with users, and specifically organizations with their own publishing tool, of what they would find useful. So there isn't a public API that you can use for that. So at the moment you can use the UI by uploading files. But what will be really useful to hear, and we want through our engagement to understand, is what would be most useful for you if there is an API, on whether you integrate it with your tool in the long term. So the answer at the moment is through through the UI. Are there any other questions or feedback? You can also raise your hand and just and speak out loud. Okay, I think we have, let me just see first.
Sahir has raised her hand.
Yeah. Hi, Sophia.
Hi, Petya. Hi, Amy. How are you guys?
It's good. Good to hear from you.
Yeah, so I have a quick one because on the previous validator, so we used to upload file by file, but one of them, which is the multinational file with lots of projects, couldn't be uploaded. And so I was wondering what is the kind of the capacity for the new validator to upload all the files all together if we have like one file for all the African Development Bank activities. Is that possible, or should we do it file by file as well?
That's a very good question. And I think directly, so obviously in IATI at the moment, most files, so those that we've tested and is with the recommendation on a file being up to 50 megabytes. So at the moment, I'm not aware of a specific restriction of what the maximum file size is. So we know that with what's currently recommended in IATI, but that's definitely one that I think it's a good question that maybe we can add and clarify more in the FAQ.
Okay, because I think it would be great to have like all-in-one file and check all the errors in
and
just by uploading only one file.
Yeah. And I think that would help with related to Laura's question on,
Okay.
I think what Leo is saying, that's currently what we know the validator would deal with, but I think, so here you're probably asking about something above the 50.
I think so, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
I will try and I will let you know.
Yeah, I think that's one great question. That's why we have this. So that's definitely one that we can share with users of, what's the range, like what is the maximum of additional ones, because we basically tested, we tested with the maximum recommended for IATI.
Okay. So the big difference between the previous validator and that one, so the previous one was really on the schema. If it was compliant with the schema, and that's it. This one will tell you, like maybe like the quality tester of Publish What You Found, that we have projects without descriptions or some content are missing here and there. This is this kind of things, right?
Yeah, so it's, I wouldn't say the kind of specific check with like Publish What You Found, but exactly what we explained. So the old one would literally only check the schema. So the critical that I talked about, where this validator checks for the rules of the IATI standard. So the error and the recommendations that Amy showed as well. So you have those additional layers. So it's not just simply the schema. So it is better in that respect because it checks those additional IATI rules. And obviously, I think thinking longer term, thinking of, what others, as I talked about the long-term picture, the first step of checking the rules, but longer term as we get to 2025, like what are the other checks that we can add to the validator on this?
Okay, and sorry, last question, and then that's it. It's not about the validator itself, but about the standard. Is there until 2025 improvements to the standard, especially on how to report on results? Is there any modification coming up or not?
So at the moment, I'm sure others can add, for the standard, as we know in standard management, if there are any requests by the community for specific changes, but in the strategic plan, I think the key bit is through the work with like data quality and data use, recognizing what the different errors are, is the view of potential, standardization of the standards. So looking at maybe in the long term having another major upgrade, but there are no specific plans at the moment for an upgrade. So here.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Okay, I think then we had Riza. Riza, can you introduce yourself and maybe which organizations, if we have new people joining? I think that would be useful.
Thanks, Petya. I'm Riza. I work for UNDP and take care of the data publication for UNDP. Petya and Amy, thanks for the presentation. It was very good to have a overview of what the validator can do. I have a couple of questions and one maybe a suggestion. I'll start with the suggestion. So it's very good, but the only problem I have is that looking at the results is that there is no place where a publisher can immediately see how the results are. So each we have to currently we have to click each of the file to identify whether that particular file has a problem or not. So I would like to see that when I go to my organization page for the validation, so if I can immediately identify how many files failing validations, or how many critical errors, how many errors or warnings I have, or even on the data file, next to the data file, if I had, at least if I can see some sort of notification, this file has a error or warning, that would be easy for me to start with that. Otherwise, sometimes organization have many files, like for example UNDP, I have around 150 plus files, so it will be difficult for me to go and click each of the file to see that whether I have any problem. And the second one, the question is that if I understood correctly, the files which have critical errors will not go to the validation. Am I right?
Yes, that is correct. It will not go through to the data store, yeah.
Data store, right? So it would be good. It would be good if it is the case, at least to put a warning sign or anything next to the data file. So even if someone is like, even for outsiders looking at someone's data quality, it will be, they will understand that, these files are not going to the data store. So if they're trying to, use the data. And the second question is, if my understanding is correct, the validator is looking for sector 100%, right? So I look at my file that, some of the, or most of the files are having this error message because it is not adding up to 100%. So how we do is that, basically we don't calculate financial, the percentage through our system. So instead what we do is we look at the number of sectors tagged and we divide it equally. We do it for STG the same way. So what happens is when you divide it, so when you have one activity linked to 3 sectors, it will be 33.33. So when you add it, it comes to 99.99. So it doesn't add up to 100. And currently the validator count it as failed. So would there be any the modification we can make? It can round it up to 100 and it identify 100. Otherwise, we have to implement something in our the mechanism to round it up for the third the sector. So that's again, if my understanding is correct, if it is how you're calculating the sector percentage, it would be good to look into that. And if you can have a, otherwise most of the files all the time our UNDP files will mostly show that error. Thanks, but yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Riza. So yeah, just to address, I think on the critical, I've answered the point. So on the critical not going into the data store. So I think a practical suggestion there around communication and the messages. So maybe mentioning that. So that's very note taken and very good suggestion to mention about the data store. On the results side and the kind of the overview. So obviously on the left side, you have the total number of errors. But I think where you're coming from is the different links to the reports. And yeah, and that's one that we've also been thinking about, organizations that have multiple files, what's easiest for them, because you do get the total. So that's something on the user interface that I think would definitely be a good suggestion for improvements. I think we probably need a bit more work of what is a better presentation, like what is more useful, but really useful feedback. And that's, yeah, what we want to here. And on the specific percentage, I think what's quite good that you're mentioning is how your systems work. So obviously, you know, the rule is that it adds to 100, and that's an important if then somebody is using the data and they want to be using that percentage split. So I think what the challenge there is kind of understanding of if there are any fixes that, you know, can be done to the system, or there are justifications of why you were not able to basically allocate the percentages in a way that they add to 100. And as you were speaking, what I was thinking is how with the work of the validator, I think more people using it, there will definitely be more reflections and kind of how to say feedback on the use of the standard and where organization might be facing challenges or not. On this one.
Thanks, Pathia.
But yeah, I've noted some of the suggestions, so we can definitely, I'll talk about ways of feedback, so we can definitely add those. So I can see another hand, and then I'll just look at the questions in the chat. And I know Leo previously had a hand up, but I think now no longer. So let us know, Leo, if there's anything. Otherwise, Laurie, yeah, no. Okay, maybe we go to Loris first, and then we'll see who is next. Hi, Loris.
Hi everyone. Thanks a lot. I have one question. One another question. I checked this morning on GitHub, and it seems that we can install the service internally. And my question is, if we decide to install it internally, all the data we will upload will stay on our own server, right? They will not be sent to your service. Is it exact?
I'll come, I think on this one, which organizations are you representing, Loris? I think just as an introduction, please. Yeah. So on installing, obviously, if you install that internally, it would not be shared. And I think what's really interesting, I think the questions you asked in the chat is maybe to even link it to our developers to understand. One thing we want to understand better is for organizations that have their in-house tools, what would be the most useful way for you to link to the validator? I presume either that's before the data is prepared or to be able to check that. So it'd be really great if I even follow up, you know, directly to understand in terms of user needs, what's the best need. But obviously, yeah, everything on the validator is public and it is on GitHub already.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. Are there any other hands raised? Otherwise, I'll quickly look through the chat messages. So we talked about the file size. So there is a question on location coordinates and latitude and longitude. So it might be useful to elaborate a bit more on this. Obviously, we're not going to verify the specific coordinates, but that's something that organizations add in their data, if I'm understanding the question correct. Latitude, longitude. So if maybe it'll be useful to let me know if there's anything else to add on this, but obviously for instance, for specific coordinates is the organization's responsibility to decide on that and add the coordinates. There isn't a specific way for us to verify whether that's the location that, for instance, they're intending to add. But let me know if there are any follow-up points and I'll be happy to.
Yeah, to add to that question about kind of what gets validated, such as location coordinates, if you kind of bear in mind, the validator can check everything that the data that is in your IATI XML files against the standard and then therefore our code lists. What the validator can't do is check anything that's in your data against an external source separate to IATI. So things like location coordinates, whilst it is possible to check, the validator doesn't have that built in because the checking that a coordinate is an actual place on Earth would require us linking the validator to an external source, which currently doesn't happen. It's only linked to what we publish and host as IATI.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Amy. Going through the other questions, so Elma is asking whether there's a warning for out-of-date data. I think if I'm again interpreting correctly, it's the validator checks only what complies with the standards. In terms of whether data is not being updated, for instance, in a year or so, you're not getting that type of warning. That's again outside the initial checks of the standard, if that's what you meant by out-of-date data. Yeah, so you might have in the validator like an organization that has published but not recently made any updates. But what the validator would be checking is kind of the rules and compliance with the standard at the moment. And then we have another question from Leo. What should we do if we fail to see the error in the dportal.org XML? I think the starting point would be to get in touch with us and find a better way, because that's exactly the user journey that we want to hear from people. If you're unable to, by following the guidance and then the steps via dportal to identify the error, I think the first point will be get in touch with us. And I think through this feedback, we can see of other ways. So, you know, are there any improvements to the tool that we can make that you can then more directly link to that error, would be my starting point. I think those were all the questions that I can see. And thank you so much, everyone. That's been really useful for us as well. Are there any other points from anyone? At this point, obviously, you can get in touch with us. If not, I think maybe we move on to the next slide to just talk about next steps. So what are the next steps? So as we said, the validator has been launched. The tool is out there for organizations to use. What we are doing is, as a secretariat and as plan of the, as I mentioned, the data quality and really making sure and driving to the goal of improving the quality of the data, is we'll be actively engaging with publishers, with our IATI members as a key activity. So some of you might have heard from us, but this is, you know, a process we're taking in the next few weeks. So we'll be proactively getting in touch and, you know, flagging those errors and trying to provide support for organizations. And the key message is very much use the tool and, you know, feedback. If you find something that's, you know, you're unable to identify the error, or you have any feedback, for instance, as Reeza suggested on the kind of interface or improvements, please do share that feedback or suggestions. And you can do that through GitHub, as I said, you know, for more technical users, or if you notice any bugs. Otherwise, you can always email us through the help desk and we'll get back to you. And one thing kind of longer term, what we really want to encourage, and it's great to see quite a few of you today joining us, is basically sharing those lessons learned with other publishers, you know, with other organizations and their experience. And then in the long term, very much having this opportunity with, you know, launching the new IATI digital platform and communities of practice towards the end of this year. So sharing that learning and experience from everyone. So that's what we wanted to share with you today. Thanks everyone so much for joining us today. And yeah, the key message is please do have a look at the validator. Do look as an organization at the errors or warnings that you identify. We do want to hear positive stories as well. If you want to, you know, talk about the changes that you have already made or improvements to the validator as a whole. But it's quite an exciting journey, and I think we do want to hear from you and yeah, and support you in that journey. Yeah. So thanks very much, everyone. I think that's it from today. We're finishing a few minutes early. So if there's anything you want to flag at the end, please do let us know. Otherwise, we wait to hear from you through the different forums or support. Thanks, everyone.